Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in layers of turbulence, very complex situation, compound effects of different things going on, a couple of wars uh, in the news headlines, and then wars that you never hear about, like in parts of Africa. And the climate is changing, and our vulnerability to the climate system is has these hotspots. And there's another pathogen percolating. Amid all of that, how do you find ways to be productive, effective, and not paralyzed? That's what Sustain What is all about. I'm Andy Revkin, been journalist for 40 years, and now I run these conversations. And I'm really pleased today to reconnect with Steve Koonin, who was a neighbor of mine in the Hudson Valley. He's an extremely knowledgeable scientist and policy figure who has been had all kinds of roles in society, science, in the corporate world, in government, and academia. Now he's moving to the Hoover Institution. I hear this fall. Congratulations on that. And he has written a book that a lot of you know about called Unsettled, which came out first in 2021. And we never were able to squeeze in a conversation around that time. In some ways, I think it's better. The book has a lot of updates. Think about all the things that have happened since 2021. Ukraine, another IPCC report, et cetera, et cetera. So the new edition is well worth exploring. Is it just an ebook or is it available?
No, it's a paperback.
Okay, good. Yeah, and you'll see there's a link to get the book if you don't. But this is going to be an introduction to the book, but also just an examination of Steve's core ideas and questions, which many of which I embrace. Many others I have some questions about. So this isn't a debate. It's going to be an exploration, conversation, which is what I'm all about here. And we're going to dive right in. The book has a big section on science. Steve, in 2014 onward, he really dug in on climate science and came up with lots of questions and lots of doubts about different aspects of the sort of narrative that has emerged, particularly on the progressive side of this question and in politics. And many of these I've written about, on my daughter's blog at the Times and in the paper. And since, we tend to have a habit of crystallizing, oversimplifying things. The way things get through the news process is one of them, and it's a problem. As I said, this isn't a debate. I think debates are interesting. Steve, you've done a bunch of them the past year or so, in 2 years as this book has come out. There are a couple. I think this graphs show you, to me, the limits of debate. You did one in Texas, and you can just see the cultural difference between Texas and Maryland universities there in terms of how the audience reacted and how things go. As I say, debate is binary and cultural, and climate is complex and not a win-lose thing. So debates can be useful. I think they're more entertainment than productive. Whether someone comes out of the auditorium and then actually changes a light bulb or something, I just don't see that often happening. But maybe, I don't know, maybe just ask me, maybe we'll talk about that very briefly, and then before we get into the book. What do you think about that question? Not just what I've just said about those debates, but, is that useful?
Are debates useful? I think they are. There is some content. It's not very much because you don't get very much time, but it does engage a broader audience and perhaps starts to get them thinking about issues in ways they may not have thought about before,
Right.
particularly the young people. So it's a hook to get people interested in the subject.
Well, and hopefully that succeeds. Everyone gets pretty locked in these days, young and old, to a certain way of thinking, and it's hard to get away from the sort of sports. Who's winning, who's losing. By the way, Roger Pielke Jr. is going to join us shortly. He's in University of Colorado Boulder, American Enterprise Institute, someone who's written a very interesting critique of the book, and he'll be joining in a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have Roger join us. He's a friend, and I've got a lot of admiration for the work that he's done and his integrity over the past 5, 10 years. So be
Yeah,
great to have him.
he's suffered a lot of slings and arrows along the way too. So just to get at your background, you've been in academia for a long time, but you were also at BP, chief scientist, the John Brown era.
Yes, that's correct. John hired me in 2004.
And Office of Science at the Energy Department. You ran that under one stretch of the Obama administration. And
It's worth saying. My role. Steve Chu was the secretary, and my role was a little bit broader than the Office of Science. It was really to be Steve's inside scientific sounding board critic and so on. So I dealt with national security issues, energy technologies, as well as the basic science.
and you're a Jason. This
I
is
have been, go
yeah.
ahead.
Now the Jasons are this. Well, you could actually explain the.
Yeah.
Is it July, August, September, October, November? Is that where the name came?
I think it's lost in the mists of time exactly what it stands for. The other alternative is that it's reminiscent of the Argonauts and the Golden Fleece, and we were after finding people who were out to fleece the government.
Oh, there you go.
I've been a member of Jason for 35 years, and it's been one of the most rewarding parts of my professional existence.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you deal with a lot of issues where there's uncertainty, paucity of data, and big consequences.
Yeah.
And that brings us to climate again.
Right.
So I want to start with a little, like on the span of expertise out there, where you sit on some of the key questions. Long time ago, I followed the research of Dan Kahane at Yale, who did work that showed quite compellingly that scientific knowledge is not an indicator of where you sit on the spectrum of worry about global warming or not global warming. And I interviewed Will Happer right around the time he was being vetted for possible Trump science advisor. And he said something. He's really interesting. When we got past CO2, we had an incredible conversation about science education, about the importance of climate science. But he said this about CO2. So I want to see how this resonates or with you. So you really do see it as a non-problem, not as something worth investing in.
Absolutely. I think not only a non-problem, I see the CO2 as good. Let me be clear. I don't think it's a problem at all. I think it's a good thing.
So you really do see, and he went on to say some really interesting things about the importance of climate science. But that struck me as so off the scale in terms of, it's good for plants in a greenhouse, okay, but if you anyway, and there you can pick a Nobel Prize winner to suit any position on global warming.
Right. So where I think one has got to sort of tease things apart a little bit. There is the basic science, the underlying science, and I should say I've known Will for 30 some odd years. He remains a good friend and colleague, and I'm in touch with him fairly regularly. I think Will and I would hardly disagree with this about the science at all. It is what it is, and of course we'll perhaps get into some of that. But it then becomes a values discussion of what's your tolerance for risk, what's your understanding and weighting of reasons not to react with alarm, and so on. So if you talk to scientists, the underlying science, nobody's going to disagree about the data, about the models, about projections, and so on. It is what it is.
Right, and I think that's a key thing going forward. And when Roger gets on, we'll talk about the politics part. Separating the values judgments from the data is really important. This has come up recently in social cost of carbon, which is so much of that's about how much you value the future or the life of a
Right.
kid in
Right.
Bangladesh
And
versus Ohio, et cetera.
yeah, and you have to fold into that, and maybe we'll get into this also. The response. What are you going to do?
Right.
And you've got to have a good quantitative understanding of the possibilities, the uncertainties, in how you might think society should respond to all this.
Right. And so,
Indeed.
so the title, Unsettled,
Yep.
is an interesting word.
Right.
Obviously, you go into a lot of depth on this in the book. A lot of your framing seems to be as a pushback, as a provocation back at those who had said their science is settled. But on a backing off from that, I'm a little concerned about the word because it's so mushy. Uncertainty, in contrast, is actionable quite often. Science is about, plus or minus X gives you a space in which to make a decision. Some even say that confidence is the inverse. It's the same word, the level of confidence, the level of
Right.
uncertainty. So why unsettled?
Yeah. So the title is actually a triple entendre. First of all, it refers to my perception of the state of the science. The science is still got significant uncertainties, which are changing with time. So yes, there are uncertainties, but if they're changing with time, things are not yet settled. The second refers to the way I felt, and I think readers feel when they discover what the science actually says, as opposed to what's in the summaries for policymakers or the media, say, or the politicians, say.
Right.
And the third, I think, unsettled is what do we actually do about all of this? And there you get into the values discussion based upon the scientific certainties, uncertainties, and so on. So that's why the title is what it is.
I think that's useful. And uncertainty, again, is a different kind of a beast. Mario Molina used to show this slide, and I loved it. We're not clear what's there, but as you add puzzle pieces, you kind of think, okay, that's something I need to respond to. And there's the Society for Deep Decision Making under Deep Uncertainty, which I got to know when I gave a talk at one of their meetings. So maybe talk a little bit about how you look at that part. If you're talking to a politician or a mayor of a city, how do you talk?
My principal goal when I talk to people and in writing the book was to give people a perception or sense of what the science actually says. And so very little in the book is my own science. It's drawn out of the IPCC reports, out of the original research literature, and out of the data. And it was meant to show people that you're not getting the truth often. And we can go into outstanding examples if you like.
Yeah, we'll get to some of those.
So that is what I try to tell people. I'm just going to tell you what we understand, what we don't understand, not only about the physical science, but about the trends in energy use, demographics, economics, and so on, and tell them you can look at all of this and you make your own value judgments and decisions. But I hope that I'm giving you a complete, transparent picture of what's going on, perhaps different than what you have heard from other sources.
Right. And one of the things I agree with you on is that if you look carefully at something like the IPCC reports, the fundamentals, they're really all the nuances there. If you look at how it ends up being spun in a press release or by the Secretary General, things go differently. And here, NASA, for example, has a whole recent. They're focusing on a study on the deep uncertainty about sea level rise and ice sheets, but that doesn't really get into the headlines.
No.
And you have a whole section on the media, of which I've been a part for a long time, and I agree with you on what abolics we're in terms of how you get some of these aspects of the realities of the science through to people without having them completely disengage in a
Yeah,
way
you
that,
know, I would blame to some extent the scientific institutions when, for example, the UN Secretary General stands up and says we're on a highway to climate hell
right.
with our foot on the accelerator, as he has done, I think, even within the last couple of days. Where is the scientific establishment saying that's just nonsense?
Yeah.
And yes, there's an issue here, but it is not as dire as you portray. On the other hand, if I, who have a much less uh, grand platform, stand up and say, you know, it's not as bad as you have heard, they jump all over me.
Right.
All right, even though I'm just quoting the reports. So I blame the scientific establishment, the national academies, the American Physical Society, AGU, and Silent for, you know, what is basically advisory malpractice for not trying to convey a clear, accurate, transparent picture of the science.
Yeah. Well, I'm with you on that. And I've seen that problem too. You have a section on the National Academies, a letter that they write as opposed to their reports, for example, even
Yeah,
National Academies reports.
yeah, yeah.
But here's where I'm probably going to bring in Roger too.
Yeah.
There you kind of portray yourself as you just did as sort of a neutral party,
Mhm.
meaning where I'm here to be to tell you what's really not known and known. And you're in, but you could write a whole nother book on how those who have actually been successful at maintaining stasis on energy and stuff often portray things. So is that this book is really focused on that one end of the alarm end of the
Yeah,
argument, but
yeah,
not the
yeah.
scam end of the argument.
Right, because the alarm is so dominant in the political discussion right
But
now.
is it? But is it?
Oh yes, absolutely. Um, Let me give you just an example. Okay, I mean, I've been out and about on the media quite a bit. I just published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today.
Yeah, today,
Actually.
right?
There's no way the New York Times would publish something that I've written, despite the fact it's based on, again, the official science. Similar for the Washington Post. There is an organization, as you probably know, called Covering Climate Now,
Yeah,
which is conspiracy is not the right word, but a coordinated effort to promote only the narrative and shut out anything that disagrees with the narrative that we've broken the climate and it's going to get a lot worse in the future. So I would say yes, the alarmist narrative is dominant.
let's bring in Roger to say hi. Hey, Roger Pielke Jr., you've been on here before.
Hello.
Hey,
And
Roger.
we're kind of talking about that interface between scientific information and the public and policy spheres. And I know this is, of course, been the area you've focused pretty much your whole career on.
Yeah, it's first let me just say it's great to be here. Andy, thanks for having me. Steve, good to see you again. Yeah, it's there's a number of issues. COVID is in there, climate is another, where issues of science are wrapped up in issues of politics, as you're saying. I'm not one who would say, hey, let's separate out the facts from the values. Good luck with that. Ultimately, on these issues, what we're actually interested in is effective decisions that lead to better outcomes for people on the planet. And I often quote Walter Lippmann, the famous commentator from more than a century ago in A Public Opinion, who said the goal of politics is not to get everyone to think alike, but to get people who think differently to act alike. So
Right.
it's really important for us to have discussions about what the evidence shows and so on. But the first idea that everyone's going to agree, not going to happen.
Yeah.
Or second, that people are going to take action because of some fact that lodged in their mind also is not going to happen. So politics is multidimensional, and it's not built on a foundation of facts as many would like to think. It's a great idea, but it's just not.
But we scientists are the only people who can put the facts into the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there are facts, and there are things that are more true and less true, and that's why we have experts, of course. But it's very easy, and I think climate's a great example for people to slip into the idea that, well, once we resolve the fact questions, then we can move on, and everyone will agree to what the proper policies are. And as you say, and as you describe well in your book, there are a lot of issues related to climate where there is a very strong general consensus. But very quickly, you move away from that, and even among the legitimate, authoritative scientific community, there's a lot of debate and discussion, as you would expect, and as it should be.
And the book, and Roger, one of the things you pointed out in your Substack, your review, which also ran, where else did it run?
New Atlantis.
Yeah. This gets back to what I was saying about debate earlier, that you felt Steve kind of has played into the sort of the us-them framing.
Yeah, I mean, number one, I think Steve's book has had enormous positive influence. I get around, not as much as Steve does, but I get around and talk to people in a lot of places. And it's a very rare that I go give a talk or go to a meeting. People don't say, "Hey, have you read Koonin's book?" And so, props to him for getting a broader discussion. But there has been this history. Everybody knows it in the climate space where it's, good guys, bad guys, alarmist deniers, and it's a Manichaean, two-sided sort of thing. And for better or worse, Steve's book, maybe not entirely his fault, but got, framed as it's on this side versus that side. You have to understand that's also part of the tactic of trying to delegitimize people who ask tough questions of science and policy, is to say, well, if you're not fully on board with A, then you must be in camp B. And so it takes a lot of work, and it's not always successful to try to push back against the two-sided framing, because everybody wants you on a side.
Yeah, and my response to that often is, I'm just quoting for you things that are in the official science, whether it's the research literature or the IPCC report, not the SPM, or the data that might give you pause to believe that we know everything about the climate, or that we certainly must do X, Y, or Z. It does take a lot of courage to write like that in public. I'm at the end of my career, and I have enough of a reputation. I frankly don't give a damn at this point what people think. You, Roger, have been doing this for, 20 years. And so props to you for having the integrity to do it. And, Roger, I've noticed that as you've changed affiliations and you're now out of academia, you're much more frank, and I think in a positive way, about some of these issues. And so, keep at it.
So talking about the science, and here I'm just showing back the table of contents there.
Yeah.
There's heat, there's sea level, there's the basics of precipitation. One thing you say fairly deep in the book is that you feel you would recommend intensifying policies at some point when the science is more settled, and that to me skirts one of the issues I've written about a little bit, which is that on some of these arenas, particularly sea level rise, I call these questions known unknowables. Like they're beyond known unknowns. Known unknown implies you can get an answer, and I see known unknowables in the context of relevant policy timescales. And so the idea of weighting, framing around the consequential nature of sea level rise, if it were at the high end, seems that it could be damaging.
So let's talk sea level rise for a minute. We have a record from tide gauges that goes back to 1900 or a bit earlier for the global sea level rise as inferred from tide gauges. And it shows, as IPCC stated in AR5, its fifth assessment report, there's a lot of multi-decadal variability in the rate of rise. And you go back, 70 years, 80 years, it was going up as fast as it is today, or almost. And then it went down, the rate, and now it's been going up again. And nobody has a good explanation for why it did that. And
Right.
until, as a scientist, you can explain that, you don't know whether the current rate of rise is anthropogenic or is due to natural variability or other influences. So, that's an example for me of what would make me feel a lot more comfortable about saying it's going to go up by a foot in 2050, which is what NOAA says.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you haven't done the science properly.
yeah, that NOAA conclusion really. I did a whole I did a post and some webcast on that. It strikes me as really way above what I see as a lay person who's been in this for 40 years. The science saying, and some states have already integrated these very high sea level rates into policy.
Yeah,
And that,
I've got a piece in the book, the updated edition, about that. I wrote a Wall Street Journal piece about that. And I like to say, who am I to contradict NOAA? But if you look at it in the context of the historical variability over the last 70, 80 years, it sure is surprising. And we will know pretty quickly, let's say within 10 years, whether it's on that path or not.
so that element of the sea level question could be clarified just by if things slow down, et cetera. Although that still leaves the big ice sheet instability questions looming. And I again there too I see very little. The movement I see in the science is toward more questions than some kind of clarity. It's
it's kind of unsettled.
Negative learning sometimes happens.
Yeah,
Mike Oppenheimer did use that term once.
Yeah.
You dig in on something, and guess what? It gets more complex.
That's science, all right, and that's
Right.
what makes it so much fun. The ice sheet melting. I mean, again, I just do the data, okay, and I published in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago a graph of the annual ice loss from Greenland, as measured or inferred by the Danish meteorological folks, and there's a lot of ups and downs, and until you can explain those, you can't with much confidence say, aha, that's CO2 in recent years.
Roger, any quick thoughts on that? And I want to show another one of your points.
Yeah, I mean, sea level rise is in many respects the perfect sort of problem we'd like to have. It's a little bit like Social Security insolvency. It's something that you can see coming inexorably in the future. It's slow onset by its very nature. We know how to respond to sea level rise. Not everyone can afford it, of course, around the world. There are places around the world where land sinking is far more important than sea levels rising, and we have to deal with that. We also know, thanks to the IPCC, that even the most aggressive efforts at mitigation, even unrealistically aggressive, are not going to modulate sea levels in anything like the near term. So sea level is one where, fortunately, we have a lot more clarity than uncertainty about the response part of it. I will say, it's one of my favorite topics is that too much of sea level focus has emphasized very extreme scenarios.
Right.
You mentioned local communities planning for extreme sea level rise. NOAA, it fortunately in the latest iteration got rid of it, but it had a scenario of 2.5 meters by 2100. It was called H++, a very extreme version, the 95th percentile of the most extreme scenario. But there are places like San Francisco Airport that are using this scenario to design their adaptation plans. And so there is a concern that if we get the risk estimates wrong, we will waste money on adapting to things we don't need to for a very long time in the future. And as Steve says, I mean, in a decade, we're going to know a lot more. So if you're building something for 2050 or 2080, we might want to be a little bit more resilient and incremental in our decision making.
So this is maybe a good place to quote one of the researchers. So Hannah Nissan, writing in 2019 in one of the research journals, says the use of climate models to guide local practical adaptation actions is unwarranted The models are unable to represent future conditions at the degree of spatial temporal probabilistic prediction. Users often have a false impression of confidence in the predictions. So that's one of the active researchers who's involved in making all these model runs.
Yeah, and Jeremy Bassis at either University of Michigan or Michigan State, I can't remember. He's a glaciologist, climate scientist, and he wrote a piece a year or two ago saying it's clear that at the local level, the key is to respond to information on timescales that is already clear through 2050. That you don't have to worry about these long-term questions. And he quoted one of his former students, a young woman, a scientist whose name I'm blanking on, wrote a piece about ice sheets and Main Street, and was trying to back away from this sort of hyper focus the media do, for sure, and many activists and some scientists on the doomsday glacier being the model of what you need to be thinking about if you live on a coast, which I think resonates with what you've just been saying.
Yeah, I like to say adaptive adaptation is the kind of strategy we need. Watch what's going on and reasonable projections over the next couple of decades.
Yeah, there's this idea out there that predictions will allow us to optimize policy responses. And of course, that's true. I mean, if you tell me what stock is going to grow the most in the next 15 years, I'll have a wonderful retirement. But the reality is, we make decisions in situations of uncertainty that are robust to uncertainty. And that takes prediction off the table if you're robust. And so I do think there's a tension in the scientific and policy communities where they meet. A lot of scientists want to make predictions. A lot of policymakers want to optimize. But the reality is sometimes we want to say, how do we take predictions off the table so we don't need them and we don't care how accurate they are? Build your house up on the bluff and you don't care how big the flood is.
Right. I want to get to this paradox of the timescales. The CO2 problem is one of very long timescales. Mm-hmm. And there are several dimensions of how that matters. And this gets to those who would use your book as a sort of an argument to not do anything and just carbonize and don't worry about this stuff. This paper from 2016 really sticks in my head all the time. Clark et al., a lot of good authors. And it was looking at this is a slightly modified version of one of their graphics, which is, you can see the Holocene lasts 11,000 years. Sea level is kind of like dribbly, a lot of variability today. And then those light blue lines going forward in time are, the high one is 50 meters, going back to a total melt. And the low one is, maybe a few meters. But those are multi-thousand year outcomes. And all the debate is about the initiation part there. What happens in the next 100 years? And anyone who says, like Will Happer did at the beginning, the quote I played, CO2 is great. Maybe it's right. Maybe we don't have to worry about our coastal cities in the long run. They'll all become floaty, weird cities, and which I've written about. But it does seem to me to still matter. The decarbonization argument, has to be part of it. And it's in your book, but it's not, so what do you do to parse the question of how do you think maybe it's about thinking about the CO2 part of this in a completely different part of the discussion than the vulnerability risk part.
Absent human influences, cities have been submerged. Historically, you can find in the Mediterranean, for example, ports that are underwater. So it's going to happen anyway. And the question is, are we accelerating it with the anthropogenic greenhouse gases? But the timescales for you have no timescale, of course, on this picture. The timescale is what we're talking about.
This is 10,000 years right here. And this is 10,000 years.
It flattened out about 8,000 years ago in the Holocene. So this is certainly more than 100 years over here. I think it's hard for us to worry about more than 100 years. We're back 100 years. So let's just worry about this and, sustainability for subsequent generations is they'll figure it out. We need to give them the resources, make sure they have the resources to be able to robustly adapt as we have or will be able to do. So tell me about 100 years, but don't tell me about more than that, because the uncertainties grow enormously.
Yeah, and on the other side of this is you mentioned you talk a lot about models, and I had this conversation with Brian Lovell in London in like 2011. He was the head of the Geological Society there, and he was a petroleum geologist. He worked in Houston a lot, and he has this great way of talking about non-model evidence for climate concern.
Now, the beauty of looking at the rock record is you don't have to run a computer model about what's going to happen. You see the whole thing. And when you put, say, 2,000 gigatons or thereby of carbon into the atmosphere rapidly, a certain number of things happen. It gets hot, the oceans get acid, they run short of oxygen, and as a result, quite a number of animals become extinct. And in the rock record, what you see subsequently is obviously the extinction event is recorded, and you see the drawdown over a period of 100, 200,000 years, the carbon from the atmosphere, which is manifested on the floor of the ocean as a development of a carbon-rich mudstone.
A mudstone. So wait, that's like a shale or a slate?
So basically, he goes on to make the argument that you can fundamentally transform climate and the oceans with a big burst of CO2. He's talking about an event that took place 50 million years ago.
Yeah, the PETM.
Yeah, and we're doing it he says we're doing it vastly more rapidly. He says, I can take a chunk of mudstone into a bar in Houston and convince an oil man that this is an issue. Is that again marginally relevant because of the timescales, or does that still play into how you see the problem?
So here's how I think about that. First of all, there's the timescale issue. Tell me about a century. Don't tell me about longer than that, because we don't know our adaptation capabilities. Presumably they'll be better. But the whole discussion that he's had gets back to something we touched upon at the beginning, namely, the science is what it is. It's the values that will determine what your action is. And you have to understand the energy system, energy demand, energy needs, energy technologies, energy economics, if you're going to advocate for action. And, Brian is a wonderful geologist. I have a lot of respect for him. I think we interacted when I was at BP. But you got to understand the other side of the story. And before you say, that's the action we need to take. And I hope we'll be able to get into that in a little bit. I mean, it's about growing energy demand. It's about economical, clean energy technologies. It's about human behavior and so on. So much more than just geology. And just to say, a lot of people working in climate science are naive or deficient in their knowledge of that side of the argument.
Well, there you go. And by the way, Ramesh Langani, who's an ecologist, he moved from the Midwest to, I think he teaches in Brooklyn. He asked the same question. What are your thoughts on when individuals, politicians, scientists do not realize when they are not separating the data from the value judgments? Maybe we could go into that a little deeper. And Roger, I know obviously this is something you think about all the time.
Yeah, I mean, this is where, context is really important. So if we ask a question, how many wolves are there now in Colorado now that they've been released? That's a sort of question where people can separate facts and values, because there is an objective empirical number. People can argue about it. Maybe some have been captured. Maybe some are off their trackers or whatever. That's what we call a tame problem. That's one where separating facts and values is achievable in principle. There are problems like wicked problems. What's the lifetime cost of a wind turbine versus a natural gas power plant versus a nuclear power plant? Very, very difficult. I'd say impossible to separate out facts and values, because it's always a mix of those. And so when there are very complicated, politicized topics for which we want science to provide input, we triangulate. We have expert advisory committees with people of different disciplines, different backgrounds, different experiences. And we try to come up with the best knowledge that we can. So rather than separating facts from values on these very complicated, wicked problems, we try to do the best integration that we can, recognizing that knowledge is more legitimate and robust when it reflects a diversity of values in there and not just the idea that we can strip it out.
I would just push back a little bit on the composition of the expert panels. I'm thinking, for example, of the public utility commissions in California, New York, states I know well, maybe Colorado, where the utilities themselves, or people who are knowledgeable about the existing energy system and what it takes to run it and build it and change it, are just not in the conversation. They're shut out because they allegedly have conflicts of interest.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is one where an effective and balanced expert advisory committee, whether it's doing some sort of, arbitrating scientific questions or honest brokering of alternatives, is going to include people that other people don't want at the table.
Yeah.
I think one of the huge, mistakes that's been made in the climate issue is the demonization of the fossil fuel industry. These are people responsible for providing 80+% of the world's energy. If there is expertise that knows well how to substitute or get off that, it's going to be in that field. So I think demonizing expertise that's inconvenient or unwelcome does not help expert advisory processes at all.
One of the big debates at Stanford now, I don't know if it's going on at Colorado, where you know the scene well, is should the university take research money from fossil fuel companies? And Stanford has sort of gone halfway to saying no, which astounds me.
Although I will say, I wrote about that. I had some students there on my webcast, and it was really interesting. There were students, including one who's funded by Exxon, who were talking about this. They're having a good dialogue about it, as opposed to just ranting or And so I don't know if that says something good about science, about Stanford, but the students there seem to be embracing that reality, and it was a really interesting conversation.
So when I interact with students, and mostly by teaching master's level students at NYU, I teach energy on one side and climate on the other side. Both of them are kind of out of the official documents. IPCC for climate, IEA or other authoritative documents for energy. And those students, when they're finished, have their eyes open. I ask them at the end of the course, how much did you learn? And so I think at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, some amount of energy literacy goes a long way to having a sensible conversation. Roger, I know a lot of interaction with undergrads and maybe has the same experience.
Yeah, and at Colorado, it's interesting. I don't know what the exact number, something like $150 million comes from royalties from oil and gas production in the state. Wow. That goes to the university. Go to Wyoming and it's much larger. And then that's how it should be. The oil and gas industry in particular makes such enormous profits. You could say they have a social obligation to help support public universities, particularly in the states where they operate. But there are better and worse ways to do it. If someone shows up and says, Professor Pielke, we'd like to fund you to do research that supports these results, that's not good. But if a corporation gives money to a university endowment, and that endowment distributes it to its faculty to do research, and the faculty has no idea the mix of where the money came from, that's a much better way to do things. So I think these blanket bans on certain companies or certain industries gets away from the fact that these industries have a social obligation to support public goods, and education is one of them.
It's interesting. Well, we could do a whole nother, I plan to do another session on here on this issue of cash on campus, and just how research ends up. I've done several webcasts on how research funding shapes I think what's done and not done. There's a point that Roger made about your book that I think he sort of found two conflicting ideas in the book here expressed at a debate that you guys had. Could you address that?
Yeah, and I did try to address it during the debate. I'll try to do the same, maybe more effectively, and maybe we can have a real back and forth about this now. Right? So, the contradiction is, I believe, and again, support, which I'll tell you about in a second, that the economic impact of human-induced climate change will be minimal, at least through the end of the century. Why do I believe that when the models are so awful? And the models say we can't even make regional predictions. And I think there are three reasons. One is you can look over the last 120 years since 1900. And the globe warmed 1.3 degrees since 1900. So, to say we're well adapted to the present climate is not correct. The climate has been changing a lot since 1900. The 1.3 degree rise is about the same as the IPCC projects under a plausible scenario for the next 100 years, of up to 2.6, 2.7 degrees. During the last 120 years, we've seen the greatest improvement ever in human well-being by almost any measure. Lifespan, GDP, literacy rate, death rate from extreme weather events, they've all gone in the right direction, despite, or maybe because of 1.3 degrees. And so as a historical analog, it looks pretty good for another 1.3 degrees. Not certain, of course, but it looks pretty good. The second is, as Roger well knows, because he is the keeper of these data, if you look over the last 30 or 35 years, the economic impact of extreme weather is small at the 0.25% of GDP level and actually declining slightly over 30 years. And then finally, people take the models and try to project economic impact going forward. The majority of those projections show minimal impact, a few percent of GDP for a few degrees of warming. And you might quibble over the details of the models. Maybe the climate model doesn't get the warming exactly right, geographically distributed and so on, but it's done as a function of temperature globally, and so it gives you some confidence. I should say that there are divergent models that give much greater impacts, but those are formulated to have the climate affect the rate of economic growth rather than the value. And as Bjorn Lomborg points out, they give kind of ridiculous projections going forward. Mongolia becomes richer than the US, for example. So, the climate modelers have learned to throw out implausible models. They threw out about 40% of the GCMs as being too sensitive. The economic modelers will eventually get to that point, and I think they'll settle on a few percent for a few degrees. Anyway, maybe not as coherent as I would have liked, but them's my reasons.
Roger, any quick thoughts? Or
Yeah, as both of you know, I'm extremely bullish and optimistic about the future. Whatever comes our way, humans are an amazing and inventive species. That said, Steve's view about the net economic impact, through the end of the century, is itself a function of a projection of climate, and so you can't have it any other way. I've been doing enough research with Justin Ritchie and Matt Burgess in recent years on climate scenarios. And we're not very good at producing scenarios for the next 5-10 years, much less to the end of the century. The issue for me is not useful projections. It's just fundamental and irreducible uncertainty. And I'd go further than uncertainty. It's ignorance. There are things we don't know. If you start your clock in 1920 and you go to 2018, you say, we've dealt with epidemics, no problem. We're on top of that one. So the past is very instructive, but I don't find it to be a lock solid guide to the future. So my thinking is, and this is what I wrote in the Climate Fix, that the risks of us humans altering the energy balance of the Earth system get you to the starting line. They get you to say, well, might we want to do anything about this carbon dioxide in particular issue? And it turns out there's a lot of other reasons why decarbonization makes sense beyond just carbon. If it was just carbon dioxide and just 100 years ago, it would be a politically impossible problem. Steve said, 100 years is like the time scale that we should be looking out to. Most normal people out in the real world are worried about what's for dinner tonight. How do I get the kids to school tomorrow? Are my kids vaccinated? What's going to happen this week, next week, paycheck, end of the month? On political timescales, it's 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, 6 years. The timescales for which policy operates is so much shorter than climate timescales. The only way it works is if we add up short-term decisions and they get us in a long-term direction. So people like to argue about 2100. I got about 10 minutes for that conversation, but then let's get back to reality.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Well, a LinkedIn watcher put in a note here. GDP assesses major cleanups of disasters as a positive for GDP. I think there's something there about how that can confound discussions.
Yeah, and let me just say that's true if you're in a wealthy country like the United States and you send in a whole bunch of disaster aid and there's a lot of economic activity afterwards. We're transferring wealth from one place to another place. But sort of like the broken windows fallacy, if you're destroying material wealth in a society, it's not a net positive for GDP in the big picture, even though locally the rebuilding may be a boom and things are better off after than before.
Yeah. Look, this is a wonderful conversation, but it is a conversation among three guys who live a privileged life compared to the rest of the world. Right. And 6 billion people will probably just say, get out of here with this stuff. I got to worry about not the next year, but I got to worry about tomorrow, how I'm going to keep the lights on or run the fridge or get from one place to another and so on. And so unless you provide a way for those folks to have adequate energy, which in my view is the principal problem in improving human welfare, you've shut those folks out of the discussion and you're having a privileged first world conversation.
Oh boy, I've had so many webcasts on that very point, including with folks from sub-Saharan Africa, and this is playing out increasingly at the climate talks, where when the first world tries to impose its passion for decarbonization on countries that are totally under-carbonized, it leads to real problems. I want to bring it, you made me think of something, and let me just throw this at you.
Climate action must be just, and this justice factor has very dramatic numbers.
This is Johan Rockström, who, the planetary boundaries scientist in Stockholm, who is very aggressive about decarbonization and all planetary limits and 1.5. But at the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, he said something I think most people just didn't hear. Here we go.
Know them all, but just to give you the latest statistics, the richest 1% must reduce emissions by a factor 30, while the poorest 50% in the world can actually increase emissions by a factor 3 for the world to stay within the global carbon budget in a fair way.
Now, what he's saying there is in the context of the carbon budget, but he's making the ethical point that we have no right to, that they actually have, if there's any carbon space left, underdeveloped countries, under-energized countries own that space. Now, we're not going to cut our emissions 30-fold. So
ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
Ain't gonna happen.
So, but I just wanted to bring him in because it was interesting to see him make the argument for energy, essentially energy justice.
Yeah. What's going to happen, and again, I go back to Roger's iron law of energy or whatever, those folks are going to get the energy they need. And they're going to do it largely with fossil fuels. Whether the West is on board with that or not, it doesn't matter. It's just going to happen. And so adaptation and technology development, develop cost-effective, low emissions technologies are the way we're going to manage this problem.
And fostering development in undeveloped places.
Well, yeah, of course.
Which is kind of the most simple way to do both, right?
Yeah.
Although the world doesn't seem serious about, the rich countries don't seem serious about doing what would actually need to be done to shift to a truly nurturing foreign policy that way. I don't know if that feels.
Yeah, underdeveloped countries have been with us for a century or more, and we haven't dealt with it. If I were a mathematician, I would say you've reduced the carbon problem to a previously unsolved problem.
Right. There are a couple more things I want to wedge in. I think we can go beyond the hour, which I'm really happy about because a lot of people seem to be watching. Getting back to the waiting thing, waiting for settled science, which we mentioned earlier. Here's a line in your book. I would wait until the science becomes more settled, until the climate's response to human influence is better determined. One thing that concerns me about that is, the nature of energy systems, right? They're very locked in. The slow nature of technological evolution and innovation, except in things like iPhones. So what about the inertia factor in the science? If we wait, and the climate is a ratchet, it's more of a ratchet than a knob, right? And John Riley said something fantastic to me years ago when I was up at MIT. It's really quick, and I want to throw this at you about the inertia problem.
What do you think is the biggest misperception about global warming, even among people who think it's a problem? What's the thing they're not getting about this?
Well, the hardest thing, I think, for policy to understand is the incredible inertia in the system that makes it so hard to really change the climate outcome for 30 or 40 years, no matter what we do. That's one of the hardest things for people to understand, I think, and one of the biggest challenges to doing anything.
Even the clean.
Now, and that obviously leads to the importance of adaptation, which you were just talking about. But on the mitigation side, doesn't it mean we have to have a head start? Doesn't it mean there's sort of
if the system is going to respond, it doesn't matter if you delayed by a decade or so, right? Yes, things have gotten a little worse, but that goes logarithmically with the CO2 concentration. So, as Nordhaus taught us in 2018, there is an optimal pace. And right now, I would submit, as I wrote in the Wall Street
What do you
Journal,
think is the biggest misperception about global warming?
Sorry, I wanted to move past
as Nordhaus taught us, and as I wrote in the Wall Street Journal today, we're moving too fast. We're moving so fast in the US and the EU that people are in fact, saying to hell with this. So develop the technologies. I think President Xi in China got it right. We will not change the energy system until we've got a viable alternative technology. We just don't have that right now.
Roger, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a natural mismatch of pace here. So if you think about climate policy, we're trying to alter the global energy economy. To the degree that climate and energy policies are successful, they have effects that are going to be measured on timescales of months and years. And as your little clip showed, cumulatively, they will have effects on the climate system that are measured in decades. So there is no one in normal society who's going to support climate policy for its effects over many decades on the climate without paying attention to what's happening on the timescale of months and years. This gets to Steve's point that if people are not seeing material benefits from climate policies, they're going to push back. And so this gets to one of the fundamental paradoxes of the climate issue, is that the most effective policies are going to be those that can be justified for reasons other than climate. Climate is the secondary benefit to energy policies. And I know, a lot of the framing has been, well, let's do climate policies and we get all these secondary energy policy benefits. From a political standpoint, that's just backwards. And so, this is where, I get in trouble with the climate advocates, because they're climate advocates because they put climate in the center. But politically, if you want to move the dial on climate has to be at the periphery, and energy access, energy security, energy costs, other environmental impacts like air pollution have to be at the center. So it's kind of like a Rubik's Cube. How do we figure out this multidimensional puzzle and obliquely affect the climate outcomes in the end?
Yeah, to get into geopolitics a second, taking off from that point, I think China push into low emission technologies, whether it's electric vehicles or small modular reactors, is not driven by their concern for the climate. It is driven by energy security issues for them. But at the same time, they're happy to develop and manufacture the technologies to sell to the rest of us, to the extent that we're willing to buy them. So yes, it is about other issues beyond CO2 emissions.
Yeah, and although it does get complicated, I'm showing a line from your book about the geopolitics, global events, particularly following Russia's invasion.
Yeah.
Ukraine have emphasized the overwhelming importance of energy reliability, affordability, etc. But I ask, don't events also illustrate the vulnerabilities created by fossil fuel dependency in the first place? In other words,
well, yes, indeed. But the world managed, right? We shifted supplies around. Prices went up a little bit. We had a warm winter in Europe that helped. The world managed. Again, there are trade-offs involved. Just on the health effects for a minute, which is one of the collateral, or maybe, as Roger says, the principal benefit. I think you have to ask, an analysis of alternatives. If you wanted to reduce the health effects of fossil fuel use, is decarbonization the best way, or the scrubbers and other pollution control technologies that you could put in? What's the cost benefit trade-off compared again to going to an all renewable system? I mean, those are pretty straightforward things to try to analyze. I don't think they're quite in your realm of wicked problems, but one can have a reasonable discussion of alternatives.
Let's talk about adaptation. I hate the word adaptation. I wrote about it since 2002 when it first percolated into the climate talks, because it implies adapting to future change, as distinct from reducing vulnerability to climate risk or climate hazards, which is a major driver of the losses that we do see from climate events right now, is exposure and vulnerability, not change in the hazard.
Well, just by the way, we see exposure and vulnerability to weather events, which may or may not be associated with a changing climate.
Oh yeah, well that's what I'm.
You said climate events. There are no.
Yeah, I know this language is.
Yes. No, precision is important.
But yeah, I agree. Language precision, particularly. Yeah. I'm going to play a tiny clip here, just on heat, for example. And this is something that my friends in the environmental movement discount. This issue of vulnerability reduction is ignored on both ends, I think, too much.
There has been, for very good reasons, a primary focus on mitigation, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We have to adapt. People are suffering and dying right now from climate change, including from heat. All of those deaths are potentially preventable. Nobody needs to die in a heat wave. So the people who...
Nobody needs to die in a heat wave. This is Christy Ebbe, who's an IPCC author, really important voice on climate and health. And we seem to miss that. So you can parse, you have almost a whole chapter on the heat question, and there's other ways to look at the data that can say different things. I criticized the Biden administration for heat.gov when they launched heat.gov. I said, well, where's your cold.gov? What are you doing to advise people when it's cold?
Right.
But so what we're really talking about is vulnerability. How do you reduce vulnerability to heat or cold? And it's really about the older lady who can't afford to run her air conditioner, or the family and who can't afford to heat their home, or all these other aspects. Having a heat aware community, so where the homeless people are. Yeah. And none of that has anything to do with climate change. And we could argue forever about the data, or we could just say we want to have less vulnerable communities. And when you put it in the context of climate adaptation, it's actually toxifying the issue.
I'm all for that. I mean, right on what you just said. I would just emphasize, many more people die from extreme cold than from extreme heat, at least at the global level. And, for the person in the clip to be talking only about heat is, I think, a significant misrepresentation.
Well, that actually, just for her sake, that was during the Pacific Heat Dome. She was in Seattle. So we were talking about heat because of that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, but I think, there was a group of scientists in Michigan health scientists who did a study showing that the things you would want to do to reduce cold and heat vulnerability in communities are essentially the same things. And so it's like, why get into these fights when we know the things that we need to do to build communities that are more focused on just the actual vulnerability side?
And it's not just the U.S. I mean, remember, the U.S. is only 4% of the population in the globe.
No, and on that front, I've done many webcasts of, showing the formula for risk. The risk is hazard times exposure factoring vulnerability.
Yeah, good.
And when you look at these issues with that lens, in fact, I've written a piece, basically, if I could have started over in 1988, I would have been writing about climate risk from the day one, with climate change being a component of risk.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the whole formula got flipped around in ways that, and Roger, you and I have talked about this.
Yeah, I mean, you know this well, both of you do, that there is a quirk in the design of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that confounds this whole issue and has, tied up the so-called loss and damage effort. And that is that climate change under the Framework Convention is defined only as changes that result from changing the composition of the atmosphere.
That's in Steve's book too.
Yeah. So in this equation here, climate change, the only adaptation that would be needed would be to changes in hazard. Exactly. And so adaptation is a cost. It's a negative associated with climate change. Because if we didn't have climate change, we wouldn't need any adaptation, according to the UN Framework Convention's definition. And so there is this confusion. Adaptation obviously has been going on forever, and it will continue, and it's focused primarily on exposure and vulnerability. But under the formal definition of the Framework Convention, exposure and vulnerability have no place. And so that has tied up this community in knots for 30 plus years.
Yeah. I'd like to make a pitch for precision in language, as I talk about in the book. There is climate change, which we can take the UN definition of anthropogenic, but there is a changing climate, which might be changing for whatever reason. And so I like to distinguish between adaptation to a changing climate versus adaptation to climate change.
Yep, this is good. I do a whole thing called watchwords, about words that need a closer look in this discussion. And the whole arena is sprinkled with them from beginning to end. It's been great to have you both on here. And if anyone has a last question or two, they can come on. I hope people do read the book. The new edition has lots of updates related to current events. Find the points in it that you disagree with, and the questions you have in the arguments, and we can keep at this. There are a couple more comments that have come in. Well, one is, there's been a lot of talk this last year because of the ocean heating and atmospheric temperatures of acceleration evidence. And a lot of scientists are dug in disputing that on both ends, that it's too soon, that it's still within the boundaries of variability. But it does raise this question again of, is it wise to wait for clarity, or do we need to give extra weight to decarbonization, given the possibility of this being something that's really taking us in a new direction?
Yeah, I think there are maybe two comments. One is, you can get fooled by natural variability.
Absolutely.
You will remember several years ago, the California governor knew normal. It's going to be dry. And in fact, California had a drought for 15, 20 years. The last several years have been above average precipitation. And if you go back and look at century-long records of, for example, the Nile River, you see long-term, maybe century scale ups and downs due to the natural oscillations of the climate system. So a little bit of humility, declaring, oh my God, it's accelerating, is warranted. The second is that the unusual warmth or heating of the last couple of years is consistent when you look at let's say, the temperature of low atmospheres derived from the EMSU data that Roy Spencer and John Christie put out. is consistent with a 2-year spike that we see associated with El Ninos. There may be an additional contribution due to the fact that we cleaned up the marine fuels or we put water vapor, or the water vapor in the stratosphere went up because of underwater volcano a couple of years ago. But it's plateaued and is starting to come down. And again, you look at similar events in the record, and there is a secular warming, but it's much less dramatic than what we've seen over the last year or two.
Yeah, this is something, this idea, one of the things that really frustrates me with journalism these days, climate journalism, and Steve, I agree with your point about climate reporters. I've been writing about climate since 1985, if you include nuclear winter, and 88 on global warming. And there's a sort of an ahistoric approach to things. No one asks, when someone says unprecedented event, no one says since when. And that's one of my watchwords, unprecedented. Right now, Vermont, is moving ahead with a law that will potentially be holding out a demand for a check from oil companies for some portion of some past disaster. And back in 2002, I wrote about this study that basically says, let me see if I can pull up the actual. This was a paper. It was looking at paleo records of extreme floods in the Northeast, including Vermont, where they looked at lake beds. And lo and behold, you get these layers of gravel every time there's a mega scouring flood. Mm-hmm. And then it'll be mud, gravel. And they found here, because they say, because climate synopses compiled from instrumental records can't distinguish underlying natural increases in storminess from anthropogenic effects, detected increases in contemporary storminess may not be a reliable indicator of human-induced climate change. And the key example was the November 1927 was this. It was a post-tropical storm, epic flood that killed the lieutenant governor, tens of thousands of cows, and is the biggest flood event in Vermont ever. And that is less severe than some of these floods that are in the record. Mm-hmm. So that study and the reporting I did at the Times on similar work, paleo tempestology, really chastened me to at least ask the question, since when, or what's your time scale? Yeah. And I hope that anyone, whether you're a reader of journalism or of activism or a writer, can just ask the since when question.
Right. It's a basic scientific technique point. If it happened before, you have to say why the recent happening is different. And right. Climate science has a hard time doing that.
Right. Well, that paper expressly said you won't be able to do it. And by the way, it was a 2002 paper, but I've been in touch with the authors and there's been nothing to rebut it ever since. So again, thank you both today for being part of this Sustain What enterprise. I really appreciate your time and the dedication you put in your lives on these tough questions. Steve, I don't know, is some of this, I know you're at Hoover and you're sort of, but looking ahead at the election, whichever way it goes, would you be considering going into government again, or are you like?
I think that's a pretty high hurdle for me right now. I'm much more enjoying the ability to look into what I want to look at and say publicly what I want to say. So, no.
Okay, and Roger, thank you for being here too.
Yeah.
So let me say, Andy, let me say, if President Biden if President Biden calls me up and wants me to be in charge of climate policy for the U.S., I'm available in January.
Okay.
So Roger, you've not had an experience in government, as far as I know.
I was student body president of Poudre High School in 1986, and that's probably I got to fail.
I mean, that kind of freedom that you're imagining is a fantasy.
Right.
Andy, let me just say, this conversation I think has been about 4 years in coming, and I've greatly enjoyed it. Happy to be talking. There are many other subjects we could dig into. And Roger, thanks for coming in with an informed perspective on these same issues.
Yeah, and let me say, let me join the echo of thanks, Andy. You've done great work for decades, opening up a space for voices that don't always have a place. Steve, your book has been enormously impactful, and it's great to have a touchstone to debate the agreement and disagreement. So I really appreciate the work both you guys do.
Actually, there's one last thing. If you have another minute or two, Steve, there's one thing I forgot to ask you, which was, you had some prickly situations at BP. You were there at a time when Beyond Petroleum was being pushed hard. And could you talk about what your perception is of where the oil companies are in this game? As Roger said, it's impossible to think about a climate solution that doesn't involve them. But is there any way for them to get out of what I see as duplicitous talk about their process emissions and not about really getting off oil?
Yeah, I don't know that it's duplicitous, but it is. It's not it doesn't address the issue. All right. Look, I like to think about the big companies, whether they're oil or other energy or any company. Actually, they're a little bit like a shark. Their main purpose is to make money, to do it predictably, to do it legally, but to make money. And they will respond to the environment. If the public and the regulators or the government says, we need you to reduce emissions, it'll be, yes, sir, we're working on that. But thankfully, they'll keep doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is producing oil and making money.
Although in the concluding part of your book, you were kind of pushing back against regulatory solutions.
Yeah, sensible regulation is reasonable. Excessive, trying to do it too much, too fast, is the kind of situation we're in. When I talk about the energy transition in a lecture, I like to show this image of Wile E. Coyote, who's been run off the cliff and is suspended in midair and suddenly realizes that there are a lot of fundamental reasons that things are not going to go well. And I think that's where we are right now with the regulators. They're starting to realize they have, to use the British phrase, over-egged the custard.
Well, that's helpful too. And I think we'll leave it there. We can always come back and dig in on some of these issues again in another show. So this is Andy Revkin in Down East Maine, signing off. We're going to do more on these questions. Always, I'd love your feedback. I'll be posting. Well, it's already posted on my Substack thing, revkin.substack.com. And this has been a really valuable discussion. It gets saved on Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. People can share it, chop it up, yell at it. Thanks again.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So long.